Tonight, we're not stepping into a gunfight. We're slipping through a swinging door into somewhere smoky, warm, and strange. The saloon. Not the kind with shootouts and clean boots, but the real kind. Dimly lit, piano keys worn soft, whiskey breath thick in the air. A place where secrets were traded for drinks, and everyone had something to hide. This was the Wild West's beating heart, part theater, part confession booth. Outlaws sat beside preachers. Gamblers brushed shoulders with girls in lace and tired eyes. Every corner held a deal, a dare, or a dream about to die. And through it all, the music, the laughter, the lies, echoing beneath lantern light and cheap perfume. This isn't the version you've seen in films. It's quieter, stranger, more human. Rituals, longing, danger wrapped in flirtation. 100 tiny moments that history forgot to write down, but the floorboards remember. So, if you like your history a little slower, a little darker, stories that drift like cigarette smoke and settle somewhere in your chest, stay close. And in the comments tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Now, let the world fade. Let the night stretch wide, and follow me into a saloon that never really closed. Let's begin the secret rules of the saloon and why breaking them could get you killed. Out in the dust-choked towns of the American frontier, saloons weren't just bars. They were the lawless beating hearts of the Wild West. But walk through those bat-wing doors without knowing the unspoken rules, and you might not walk back out. What if I told you that sitting in the wrong seat could get a man shot point blank, not in a duel, but for disrespect? That's how serious things were. Every saloon had its own customs, superstitions, and invisible boundaries, a sacred code enforced not by police, but by pistol. Some chairs were owned by ghosts of gamblers who never lost, and the locals would tell you to leave them empty, or risk being cursed. Others belonged to local gunslingers, who'd carved initials into the wood and backed up their claim with cold steel. Even how you ordered your drink mattered. Ask for the wrong thing the wrong way, and the barkeep might stop polishing that glass and give you a look that meant, choose your next words carefully. And if you bumped a man's shoulder without apologizing, you might find yourself dragged into the street before you could finish your whiskey. Saloons were packed with deadly etiquette, and everyone inside knew the rules, except the newcomers, and that's why they didn't last long. And then there were the mirrors. Behind the bar, almost every saloon had one, not for vanity, but survival. The mirrored wall wasn't decoration. It was a way for bartenders to see if someone was reaching for a gun behind their back. Because in the Wild West, a smile could be followed by a slug of lead. The barkeep might seem like just another character in a dusty town, but he was often the most feared man in the room, armed with a shotgun under the bar and a memory sharp enough to track every grudge in the county. But what happened when someone broke the rules? Well, that's when the piano stopped. That's when chairs scraped against the floor and eyes narrowed. Because in most saloons there was no sheriff to step in. Justice came in the form of a fist, a bottle, or a bullet. And once the smoke cleared, the piano would start again. Like nothing had ever happened. Because that, too, was part of the unspoken rule. Don't ask questions. Don't talk about it. And above all, never stop the music. But speaking of music, have you ever wondered why the piano never stopped playing, even during full-blown shootouts? Why the piano never stopped playing, even during shootouts? If you stood outside a Wild West saloon during a gunfight, you might hear glass shatter, voices raised, chairs flipped, but strangely, one sound almost never stopped. The piano. Its jangling tune might stutter or skip, but it kept going, almost defiantly, as though the ivory keys were pushing back against death itself. Why would anyone keep playing music with bullets flying just feet away? Was it courage? Or something far darker? Some say the piano player wasn't brave. He was scared out of his mind. But he knew if he stopped, he might be next. Saloon owners were known to threaten pianists behind closed doors. If the music stops, so do you. Because the second that cheerful honky-tonk melody died, the illusion of safety died with it. The music was a mask, a thin cover stretched over the chaos, and without it, the place could unravel into full-blown anarchy. What's even more disturbing is that some pianists were actually chained to their stools, forced to play while mayhem exploded around them. One tale from a mining town in Arizona told of a pianist who lost 3 fingers when a bar brawl turned into a knife fight, and still kept playing with his bloodied hand because the owner screamed, "Don't stop or you're next." The customers didn't flinch. That was just another Tuesday. But it wasn't always about force. Some pianists kept playing because they were paid not just in whiskey and coin, but in secrets. The piano player saw everything. He was the soundtrack to confession, betrayal, and murder. He heard whispered plots between outlaws, saw who slipped poison into whose cup, and watched men disappear into back rooms with blood on their boots. And if he played well, if he never stopped, maybe no one would remember that he saw too much. And then there were rumors of pianos being haunted. One saloon in Nevada swore its upright piano played itself every night after a gambler was shot mid-song, face first into the keys. Locals claimed the keys would twitch when no one was near, and sometimes play the same tune the gambler had been playing when he died. People still sat and drank while it happened, pretending not to hear. So the next time you imagine a saloon piano tinkling softly under the buzz of drunken laughter, remember this. That cheerful music was a lifeline, a mask, and sometimes a warning. It didn't stop because the second it did, something worse than silence would fill the room. Reality. But what about the women who worked there? The so-called saloon girls? Were they just dancers and hostesses, or something more complicated and far more dangerous? We'll step behind the red velvet curtains and reveal what saloon girls were really paid to do, and how many of them held secrets that could destroy the most feared men in town. What saloon girls really did behind closed doors. They were the glittering ornaments of the Wild West saloon, dressed in ruffled skirts, corsets, and perfume strong enough to choke a horse. But the so-called saloon girls weren't just there to dance. Behind every smile was a strategy, and behind every touch, a transaction. The truth is, most people had no idea what these women were really doing. They weren't just entertainers. They were spies, hustlers, survivors. Some were paid not to seduce, but to gather secrets. Powerful men, drunk on whiskey and pride, let slip details they shouldn't have. Land deeds, robbery plans, who was cheating who in a poker game, and the saloon girls. They remembered every word. Sometimes they passed these secrets along to the bartender, who sold them to the highest bidder. Sometimes they used them for blackmail. Because in the Wild West, knowledge was just as deadly as a six-shooter, and twice as profitable. Others were caught between violence and desperation. The storybook version of a saloon girl, flirtatious, free-spirited, singing on the piano, was a fantasy. In truth, many had been forced into the job after fleeing abusive husbands, violent towns, or starvation. They didn't work in saloons because they loved the nightlife. They did it because there were no other options. And once inside, they couldn't always leave. Some were under contract, not legal contracts, but binding all the same. Enforced by the saloon owners' hired men. Try to run, and you might end up disappeared. But don't mistake them for powerless. The cleverest saloon girls knew how to turn the tables. One famous woman in Dodge City made herself the unofficial queen of the town by getting half the sheriff's office in her debt, through charm, manipulation, and cold, calculated whispers. She had no gun, no badge, and no real protection, but she controlled the fates of at least 10 dangerous men, with a flick of her wrist and the promise of a kiss. And not all saloon girls played their roles with grace. Some were as deadly as any outlaw. There are records, hushed ones, of women slipping cyanide into drinks, planting pistols in gamblers' boots, or distracting men just long enough for hired guns to finish the job. They weren't just caught in the Wild West's chaos. Sometimes they created it. But what about the drinks they were serving? Some of the cocktails poured in these saloons weren't just disgusting. They were downright deadly. We'll take a sip of the Wild West's most dangerous drinks, the poisons in disguise, the hallucination-inducing brews, and the rot-gut whiskey that could make a man blind overnight. The bizarre drinks that left cowboys hallucinating for days. You could smell it before you ever saw it, the sharp burn of alcohol thick in the air, soaked into the floorboards, mingling with sweat and cigar smoke. But the drinks served in Wild West saloons weren't your modern-day whiskey neat. They were chemical cocktails so foul, so dangerous, some didn't just get you drunk, they sent you to another dimension. And if you were unlucky, they sent you to the Undertaker. They called it rot gut for a reason. The whiskey wasn't aged or refined. In fact, it often wasn't whiskey at all. Saloons cut costs by mixing grain alcohol with anything that added color and burn. Tobacco juice, kerosene, turpentine, and even sulfuric acid. If it went down hard and lit a fire in your chest, it was authentic. Some brews were so toxic, a single glass could strip the lining of your stomach. Others left cowboys blind, paralyzed, or hallucinating for days in the back alley. One popular drink was called tarantula juice. It was made from industrial alcohol strained through coffee grounds to mask the taste. If that didn't kill you, the hallucinations might. Men claimed to see demons dancing across the bar, snakes slithering across the piano, or the ghost of a woman they'd killed years ago, smiling at them from the mirror. And the terrifying part? Nobody stopped them. That was just another night in the saloon. Then there were the local specialties, drinks spiked with opium, cocaine, or peyote. In Arizona territory, one bar offered a concoction called Devil's Breath, a crimson liquid said to make you feel invincible for 10 minutes, right before you collapsed in a seizure. Men begged for it. Some died for it. The bartenders didn't care. They wiped the counter clean, tossed the body in the alley, and kept pouring. But not all drinks were designed to kill. Some were crafted to control. Saloon owners used doctored drinks to keep customers docile, to loosen lips, or to knock out an unwanted guest without drawing a gun. A sleeping man was easier to rob than a dead one, and the saloon staff knew exactly how many drops of laudanum it took to drop a full-grown gunslinger. And in some towns, there were rumors that certain drinks weren't just dangerous. They were cursed. One old tale spoke of a bottle that passed from town to town, sealed in black wax, covered in strange markings. Every saloon that opened it burned down within a week. True or not, nobody ever admitted to drinking from it. But somehow, the bottle kept showing up. So next time you imagine cowboys clinking glasses and laughing over shots, remember this: many of them weren't toasting. They were gambling with their lives, one sip at a time. But while the drinks were dangerous, what lay beneath the floorboards was even worse. We're heading underground, into the hidden gambling dens, cheating rings, and secret duels that turned saloons into deadly battlegrounds of deception. The hidden gambling rings beneath the floorboards. Above ground, the saloon was already a powder keg. Drunk cowboys, armed outlaws, and dealers slapping cards onto sticky tables. But beneath the floorboards, in rooms lit by oil lamps and thick with cigar smoke, the real games were played. These weren't just poker tables. These were underground kingdoms of risk, rigging, and ruin. And the men who played there didn't just bet their money. They bet their lives. Some saloons had trapdoors hidden behind the bar or under the piano, leading to secret basements where only certain men were allowed. Inside, fortunes changed hands in a single night. Men entered with gold nuggets in their pockets and left without their boots. Others never left at all. Because if you were caught cheating in one of these hidden games, the penalty wasn't losing your hand. It was losing a finger. Or worse, your tongue. These rings weren't just about cards. They were part of a larger criminal web. Sheriffs were paid to look the other way. Bounty hunters took bets on which outlaw would be caught next. Even priests in some towns had seats at the table, and not to preach. The house always won, because the house was backed by violence. If someone got too lucky, a dealer might signal with a cough. Moments later, a fight would erupt upstairs, staged to distract from the quiet disappearance of the man who'd been winning too long. Marked cards, rigged dice, and mirrors hidden in whiskey bottles. Cheating was as much an art form as the game itself, and the dealers were masters of it. They could shuffle a deck to their advantage without ever lifting an eyebrow. One dealer in Deadwood was said to have 5 different ways to deal a losing hand, and 3 of them involved the help of the saloon girl leaning over your shoulder. But the worst games weren't for money. Some gamblers played for property, ranches, mines, even the deeds to entire towns. One man lost his wife in a poker game, another his freedom. The winner forced him to sign a contract that turned him into a debt slave, cleaning outhouses and sweeping the bar for the rest of his miserable life. And yet, night after night, men kept coming. Why? Because the rush of the gamble was stronger than the fear of the fall. In the Wild West, being broke wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. So the game wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. But not every saloon dealt in cards. Some dealt in something far stranger. Justice. We'll enter the twisted courtroom of the saloon, where drunken crowds became juries, outlaws were tried over whiskey, and the only law was what the loudest man shouted. How saloons became the Wild West's darkest courtrooms. They weren't built for justice, they were built for whiskey. But in the Wild West, when lawmen were outnumbered and courthouses were dusty fantasies, the saloon transformed into a courtroom, a jail, and an execution chamber, all in one night. It began with a bottle, ended with a verdict, and sometimes in between. A man was dead before the gavel ever fell. Because in saloon justice, the rules were as twisted as the men who enforced them. You see, in many frontier towns, the saloon was the only place large enough to hold a crowd, and the only place loud enough for people to pretend justice was happening. A man might be dragged in by his collar, bleeding from a bar fight, or accused of cheating at cards, horse theft, or something worse. There was no real trial, no judge in robes, just a bartender with a shotgun, a few respected drunks, and the loudest voice deciding the punishment. The jury? Whoever hadn't passed out yet. The evidence? Usually hearsay. Sometimes just a look. One famous case in Abilene saw a man tried for murder over a spilled drink. Witnesses claimed he looked like he was reaching for a weapon. Others said he insulted a man's hat. Either way, the saloon owner declared him guilty within minutes. His sentence? Tossed into the street and told to ride until he disappeared. If he was ever seen again in town, he'd be shot on sight. That was mercy. In many towns, justice meant a quick hanging from the balcony railings, with the crowd still holding drinks, cheering between sips. In Tombstone, a notorious saloon known as the Devil's Spur held trials every Friday night. Locals called it hanging hour. Crimes ranged from petty theft to being suspicious. The accused would be made to stand on the bar while the saloon pianist played a somber tune. Then the jury, a rowdy circle of regulars, would shout "hang" or "spare" until a consensus was made. Most didn't survive the night. The piano never stopped playing, and the bartender never stopped pouring. But it wasn't just men who faced saloon justice. Women were punished too, often for accusations that couldn't be proven. Jealousy, rumor, or rejection could land a woman in front of the saloon's makeshift court. One saloon girl was accused of witchcraft after 3 patrons who flirted with her all died within the month, one by snakebite, one in a card fight, and one who simply vanished. The town didn't need proof. They shaved her head, tied her to a barrel, and rolled her out of town. Sometimes, justice was just an excuse for cruelty dressed up as order. But don't think for a second that saloon justice was fair or final. Corruption ran deep. If you had the coin, you could buy your way out of anything. Saloon owners wielded more power than some mayors. They controlled who stayed and who vanished. They were the judge, the warden, and the executioner, and no appeal could be filed against a man with a double barrel behind the counter. Sometimes justice didn't come at all. A saloon might look the other way if a well-liked local committed murder, blaming it on misunderstanding or accident. If a stranger was accused, however, the town could turn to vengeance in hours. There were no second chances, no appeals, and no graves with names, just holes in the ground behind the stables. It wasn't about justice, it was about power, and about survival. If you were a drifter, you learned quickly to keep your voice down and your hands visible. Don't stare too long, don't play cards too well. Don't laugh too loudly when someone else loses. Because in the saloon court, a glare was a threat, silence was guilt, and survival was a matter of instinct. And what about the barkeeps who presided over these twisted courts? They were no saints. Many of them had criminal pasts. Some were retired gunslingers or ex-cons who took over saloons as a way to control the chaos instead of being consumed by it. They traded bullets for bar stools, but they still kept their pistols close and their enemies closer. But here's the strangest truth of all. Some saloons wrote their own laws. Chalkboards behind the counter listed rules like no spittin' on the floor, no talkin' politics, and no killin' before sundown. Break those, and you'd face saloon justice. A mock trial, maybe a public humiliation, or a forced duel out back. These weren't just rules, they were theater. Rituals to keep the illusion of order in a world that had none. So, the next time you picture a dusty Western saloon filled with music and laughter, remember, it was also a place where justice bled from the barrel of a gun, and the crowd's cheer could mean your end. But what about the free lunch signs painted on saloon doors, the promises of food for anyone who bought a drink? Were they generous, or something more sinister? We'll uncover the shocking truth behind the Wild West's so-called free lunches, and how they led to addiction, manipulation, and the dirtiest business trick you've never heard of. The shocking truth about free lunch in Western bars. It sounded like a miracle in a hungry world. Free lunch with drink. Painted in bold letters on dusty saloon windows from Dodge City to El Paso, the phrase lured travelers like moths to a flickering lamp. But nothing in the Wild West came without a price. And that free lunch? It was one of the smartest, dirtiest traps ever set in American business. Because the truth was that food wasn't free. It was bait, and the men who took it often paid far more than they ever expected. The free lunch wasn't a kindness. It was a calculated strategy to get men hooked, hungry, and in debt to the bottle. Saloons would lay out platters of salted meats, pickled eggs, spicy sausages, vinegar-heavy vegetables, and hard, dry bread. These weren't meals designed to nourish. They were designed to dehydrate, to make your mouth burn and your throat itch. The goal? Make you so thirsty you'd order drink after drink just to wash it all down. It worked like a charm. Cowboys, miners, gamblers, even preachers fell for the scheme. They'd come in for the promise of a hot plate and leave with empty pockets and blurred vision. And that was the plan. The drinks they bought to chase the salt cost more than a proper meal at the general store. But by then, they were too buzzed to care, or too ashamed to walk away. Some saloons took it even further, turning the free lunch into a tool for control. If you ate from the plate, you owed the bar. That meant you couldn't refuse a drink when offered. You couldn't skip your turn in a round. And if the barkeep told you to leave, you had to, or face the wrath of the men who saw you eat but not pay your dues. It created a kind of invisible debt, a social contract written in salt and whiskey. And the quality of the food, often as questionable as the motives. There are stories of saloons serving spoiled oysters hauled in on warm trains from hundreds of miles away, or soups made from days-old bones simmering in reused water. One Nevada saloon served a mystery stew that was said to contain everything from rattlesnake to rat. Didn't matter. The men still lined up, bellies growling, pride swallowed. But the real tragedy wasn't the food, it was the cycle. A man came in hungry. He got a bite, he bought a drink. That drink led to another. Maybe a card game, maybe a fight. By the end of the night, he might have lost a week's wages, his horse, or even his boots. And the next day, he'd come crawling back, because at least the lunch was still free. Some saloon owners even hired men to sit near the door, praising the lunch loud enough for newcomers to hear. These plants acted like satisfied customers, laughing and patting their bellies, exaggerating how generous the bar was. It created an illusion, a kind of carnival trick. But in reality, the saloon wasn't feeding the town. It was feeding off the town. And here's the most twisted part. The free lunch wasn't illegal. It was business. Smart business. In a lawless land, manipulation wasn't frowned upon. It was admired. Saloon owners who ran the best lunch traps became local legends. They were innovators, pioneers of what would one day be called loss leaders in modern marketing. They weren't running saloons, they were building empires, one pickled egg at a time. But even the smartest trick couldn't control everyone. Some men took the lunch and refused to drink. They were watched closely. If they tried it again, they were often asked to leave, sometimes with fists. In harsher towns, repeat offenders were blacklisted. Others disappeared. No one ever said they were killed, but their plates were never touched again. The free lunch was never about food. It was about psychology. Hunger was universal. Thirst was profitable. And once a man sat at the bar with a full plate and an empty glass, the saloon had him, and yet, sometimes even a free lunch wasn't enough to hold a crowd's attention. That's when saloons turned to more extreme methods, bizarre animal acts, violent wrestling matches, and dangerous stunts designed to shock and awe. We're stepping into the strangest chapter of saloon life, when bears walked on hind legs, buffalo were brought indoors, and deadly snakes were let loose, all for the amusement of a drunken crowd. It's entertainment, Wild West style, and you won't believe what they did to keep the customers coming back. When bears, buffalo, and snakes were saloon entertainment. It wasn't enough to serve whiskey that could peel paint or offer salted meat that kept men drinking until they forgot their names. The Wild West saloon wasn't just a bar. It was a theater of chaos. And sometimes, the show included claws, hooves, and fangs. When cards and fights got old, when music lost its luster, saloon owners brought out the wildest acts imaginable. And I mean wild in the truest sense. In some towns, a bear was part of the staff. Yes, a live bear, chained to the bar or trained to pour beer into tin mugs. One grizzly named Old Grunter was famous in Colorado for tending bar, with a muzzle strapped tight to his face and a keg strapped to his back. Patrons laughed, cheered, and took bets on whether the bear would maul someone before midnight. And sometimes he did. One drunken cowboy lost a hand after trying to wrestle him for fun. The bar comped his drinks for life, if he could still lift the glass. Buffalo were paraded indoors, too. One legendary saloon in Cheyenne held Buffalo Nights, where a half-grown bison was led inside and tied to a post near the piano. It was a gimmick, yes, but a dangerous one. On one occasion, the animal panicked during a gunshot celebration and charged through the bar, destroying tables, injuring 4 men, and allegedly crushing a poker cheat under its hooves. The saloon closed for 2 days. Then it reopened with a new sign: No Buffalo Tuesdays. But the strangest and most dangerous of all were the snake shows. In the hotter desert towns, barkeeps kept rattlesnakes in glass boxes on the bar. Some bars even staged snake duels, 2 serpents thrown into a pit to see which would strike first. Bets were taken. The air got thick. Men screamed and shouted. But sometimes a snake got loose. Sometimes it didn't want to fight another snake. It wanted out. There was one famous incident in southern Arizona where a rattlesnake escaped a whiskey bottle and slithered into the piano. The pianist, too drunk to notice, continued playing until the snake bit his foot. He finished the song, they say, before collapsing on the keys. He died an hour later. The saloon ran a promotion the following week. First drink pre if you find the snake. Why all the madness? Because competition was fierce. On a single stretch of road, you might find 5 saloons, all clamoring for the same coin. Owners needed to stand out. If one bar had a piano, the next needed a dancing mule. If one served free lunch, the other added alligator wrestling. It was about shock, about keeping the drunks awake, about giving men something they'd talk about the next morning, if they made it to morning. Some barkeeps paid traveling showmen to bring freak acts, like 2-headed calves, fire eaters, or tattooed ladies who let you touch the ink for an extra nickel. Others employed dwarves in costumes, or women who sang bawdy songs while walking barefoot across broken glass. Anything to keep the patrons entertained, distracted, and most importantly, drinking. But this wasn't just about money, it was about power. When a man walked into a bar and saw a live cougar chained in the corner, he knew who owned that town. It wasn't the sheriff, it was the saloon boss. These wild acts were a flex, a roaring declaration that here anything goes. And if you didn't like it, you could get out or get buried. Of course, not everyone survived the entertainment. Men were trampled, gored, bitten, and in some cases, eaten. But these stories only added to the saloon's legend. Blood made the floor sticky, sure. But it also made the bar famous. And in the Wild West, fame was its own kind of currency. And here's the part no one talks about. Some of the animals weren't meant to entertain. They were meant to protect. A saloon in Montana kept a trained mountain lion behind the bar. They said it had been raised from a cub and only responded to the owner's whistle. Rumor was, if a fight broke out, he'd let the cat loose. Most people thought it was a joke, until a brawler ran behind the counter during a scuffle and never came back out. The saloon closed early that night. The mountain lion got extra steak. So next time you picture a saloon, don't imagine quiet drinks and lazy piano tunes. Imagine wild animals pacing behind chairs, rattlesnakes coiled in jars, and drunken cheers as buffalo charge across the floor. That was the true Wild West. Part zoo, part battlefield, and part circus. And through it all, the drinks kept flowing. But even stranger than the animals was what happened when the saloon turned silent, when outlaws sat in corners and whispers replaced laughter. Because some saloons weren't about fun at all, they were about planning. We'll slip into the shadows and uncover how Wild West saloons became the headquarters for robberies, killings, and conspiracies that shook entire territories. The entertainment was wild, but the plotting was far deadlier. How outlaws used saloons to plot. Heists and killings. At first glance, the saloon looked like chaos. Cards clacking, spurs jangling, laughter echoing beneath swinging lanterns. But beneath the surface noise, behind the puff of cigar smoke and clink of glasses, something colder was always at work. Because for many, the saloon wasn't just a place to drink, it was a war room, a command post, a nest of vipers where the most dangerous men in the West came not to unwind but to scheme. Some outlaws came through the front door like kings, dust-covered, cocky, and loud. Others crept in silent as the night, blending into corners, watching everything. They weren't there for music. They weren't there for the girls. They were there to meet with others like them, gunmen, forgers, safecrackers, and killers, to plan jobs that would leave banks empty and sheriff's offices burning. Saloons, after all, offered the perfect cover. Noise, confusion, and no shortage of ways to disappear if things went bad. Every major heist west of the Mississippi, it seemed, had its seeds planted between whiskey-soaked whispers at the back of a saloon. In some towns, the bartender knew more than the marshal. He knew which gang was passing through, who needed a fresh horse, and which door to leave unlocked on Saturday night. Sometimes he got a cut of the score. Other times he just wanted to stay alive. Either way, he kept his mouth shut. Because in the West, silence was survival. One infamous gang known as the Whistle Cutters used a saloon in Dodge City as their base of operations. They'd sit at separate tables acting like strangers, all while passing notes under beer mugs and spelling out robbery plans by tapping spoons on their glasses in a secret code. They hit 3 banks in 1 week and vanished into the desert like smoke. All thanks to careful planning done under the noise of a honky-tonk piano and the clatter of poker chips. But it wasn't just robberies. Killings were plotted here too, some quick and bloody, others months in the making. If a bounty hunter was getting too close, his name would be spoken over a drink. If a rival gang moved into town, their deaths were scheduled between rounds. Some murders were paid for on the spot. A stack of coins slid across the table, and a nod to the man in the corner with a scar down his cheek. That was all it took. Saloon girls were often part of these dark dealings. They weren't always in the loop, but they heard things. And the smartest ones knew when to keep their mouths shut, and when to sell a secret to the highest bidder. One woman in New Mexico made a fortune tipping off stagecoach drivers about planned ambushes. Another lured a sheriff into the arms of a gang, just so they could steal the town treasury. She disappeared the next morning. So did the money, and the most elite saloons, the ones with carpeted floors and chandelier lighting, had upstairs rooms with locked doors and guarded staircases. That's where the real plotting happened. Behind closed doors, gangs forged alliances, bought corrupt lawmen and split territories like emperors dividing empires. Outside, a piano played. Inside, fortunes and fates were decided with a flick of the wrist. Saloons even served as dead drops. One bar in Deadwood had a loose floorboard beneath a corner booth. Outlaws passing through would leave notes, maps, or gold nuggets under the plank for others to find later. No one ever talked about it, but everyone who mattered knew it was there. And if the wrong man reached for it, he wouldn't reach for anything ever again. Sometimes, a single drink meant death. A shot of whiskey passed to the wrong man could be laced with opium, or worse. Bartenders weren't always innocent. Some were bought. Some were blackmailed. and some were just sick of cleaning up blood, so they made sure the job was done quietly. And yet, the planning wasn't all darkness. Sometimes it was dazzlingly clever. Outlaws used fake arguments to mask real messages. They hid maps in the lining of their hats, scrawled codes in spilled beer foam, or whispered instructions in a drunk man's ear just loud enough for the intended listener at the next table. The saloon wasn't just the heart of the town, it was the brain of the underworld. But eventually, the plans came to life. The bank exploded. The marshal was found with a note pinned to his chest. A train derailed under the cover of night, and by then, the outlaws were long gone, their chairs still warm, their drinks half finished. So the next time you see a Western film where cowboys toast and laugh over cards, remember this. Behind the curtain of music and mayhem was a darker rhythm, one of power, betrayal, and whispered death. But sometimes, outlaws didn't need to whisper at all. Sometimes, their power was already written into the walls. Because the Wild West didn't run on laws, it ran on codes. We'll unlock the final secret of the saloon, the unspoken code, the sacred rules of honor, blood, and silence that kept the peace in a lawless world, until someone broke them. The unwritten code that governed life and death in every saloon. There were no official rule books in the Wild West saloon. No posted laws, no signed charters, no town meetings. But that didn't mean there were no rules. In fact, the saloon operated by a code far stricter and far deadlier than any court of law. Break it, and you didn't get a warning, you got a bullet. Or worse, you got ignored, shunned, erased. Because in the West, being feared was survival, but being respected was power. The first code was simple: never draw first, unless you're certain. No gunslinger worth his boots wanted to be known as a coward, so you didn't pull your revolver unless you were ready to use it, and willing to die for it. A man who drew too soon might win a duel, but he'd lose the town. He'd be watched, distrusted, and one day shot in the back with no one shedding a tear. The second rule? Never interrupt a man's drink. It sounds trivial, almost funny. But in a saloon, it was sacred. If a man was alone at the bar with a glass in his hand, he was either thinking or grieving, and both were dangerous. Bother him at the wrong time, and you might find yourself picking your teeth up off the floor, or waking up in a trough with a new scar down your cheek. And then there was the code of the table. If you sat in for a poker game, you played fair, or at least you cheated smart. Getting caught meant one of three things: a public beating, a branding with a hot coin, or a duel outside with the dealer himself. And if you won too much, you left some chips on the table, not as a tip, as a courtesy. Because in the saloon, greed was a warning sign, and the house never liked to feel like prey. Even the saloon girls had a code. You didn't touch unless invited. You didn't follow them out unless they asked. And if you did, and crossed the line, you weren't just fighting the girl, you were fighting the bartender, the piano player, and half the regulars. Some women carried knives in their boots or tiny derringers tucked in garters. A single snap of a fan could mean "help me," and help always came. The code extended to silence. If a fight broke out, you didn't talk about it after. If someone died, you looked away. If a man you knew yesterday was gone today, you toasted his name once and never spoke it again. Because in a world where every face might be your killer, secrets were safer than truths. The bartender enforced the code without ever raising his voice. He kept a shotgun beneath the bar, a club near the register, and a list in his head of who was allowed in and who wasn't. He didn't make speeches. He gave looks. And if a man ignored the warning, he was gone by sundown, or buried before sunrise. But the code didn't just keep order, It held the town together. Men who hated each other could sit side by side at the bar, nod once, and sip their drinks in peace. Not because they liked each other, but because they respected the rules. The saloon was neutral ground. Break that neutrality, and you didn't just invite trouble, you declared war. One famous incident in Kansas saw two rival gangs share a bar for months, ignoring each other completely. Then one night, one man stood too close to another at the bar. No words, no shove, just presence. That was all it took. The next morning, 7 men were dead. The saloon rebuilt, but the code changed. Now, if you saw a rival, you left. No questions. No eye contact. That became the rule. The unwritten laws were enforced not by lawmen, but by memory. Reputation meant everything. If you were known as a cheat, a coward, a liar, it followed you. From saloon to saloon, territory to territory. And reputation didn't fade. It got passed around like a shot glass until someone finally decided to end it with lead. But here's the strange, almost poetic part. The code worked. In towns with no sheriffs, no judges, and no jails, the saloon code kept a kind of order. It wasn't just violence that held the walls up. It was understanding, fear, respect, a mutual agreement that if they let the chaos win, everything would fall apart. The saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was the last defense against the total collapse of civility. So when you picture those old saloons with swinging doors and dusty stools, remember this. Every man who walked through them followed rules written in blood, silence, and history. The code didn't save lives, but it gave them meaning. And in the West, that was all a man could ask for. But what happens when that code is broken by the very men who created it? When sheriffs, barkeeps, and killers all cross the line? In our next series, we'll dig deeper into the legends, the betrayals, and the infamous final nights of the West's most feared saloons. The drinks may have stopped flowing, but the stories, they never did. The final nights of the most feared saloons in the West. Every saloon had its last night. Sometimes it came quietly, with chairs stacked and lights dimmed. Other times it ended in blood, gunpowder, and flames licking the rafters. Because no matter how feared a saloon was, no matter how many men it buried or secrets it held, the Wild West always found a way to burn its legends down. And when those final nights came, the walls seemed to whisper everything they had seen, just before they collapsed into dust. Take the Copper Fang in southern Arizona. It was known for its dark wood walls, always cool to the touch, even in the blistering desert heat. Locals said it was cursed. The barkeep never smiled, and the piano never played anything but a broken waltz. But it was also the safest place in a lawless mining town. Why? Because the man who ran it, Gentleman Josiah, had once slit a sheriff's throat in front of 20 witnesses and poured himself a drink while the body bled out. The code in the Copper Fang was unbreakable. No guns on the tables, no questions about scars, and never, ever speak the name of a dead man. Those who disobeyed vanished. Some said Josiah buried them beneath the floorboards. Others swore he sold their bones to the old doctor who came in every Thursday for supplies. Either way, no one asked. But codes, no matter how strict, always crack. It ended with a gambler, a man who didn't know the rules, or maybe didn't care. He wore a silver chain and laughed too loudly. When he won a crooked hand, he bragged. When the bartender told him to quiet down, he threw a coin in his face. Josiah said nothing, just walked into the back room. Moments later, he returned with a pistol carved from ivory, a weapon no one had ever seen him draw before. He shot the gambler once, then twice more, even after the man was already on the floor. That would have been the end of it, except the gambler wasn't alone. He'd come with friends, hired guns, They opened fire. The room exploded. Bar stools shattered. The old chandelier fell. Josiah took a bullet to the throat and still managed to kill 2 more men before collapsing behind the counter. The copper fang burned to the ground that night. Some said it was lightning. Others swore it was set on purpose. By the town. By the bartender's ghost. By the West itself. But the copper fang wasn't the only saloon to go out in flames. The Devil's Tin in Colorado met its end in a poker game gone wrong. A drifter named Elroy Needle Grant bet the deed to a mine he didn't own, and when the winner tried to collect, Needle shot him dead in front of 30 people. The bartender, tired of the blood, poured lamp oil across the floor and lit a match. Said he'd rather see the place burn than clean up another corpse. He walked out without looking back. The piano kept playing until the fire reached its strings. Then there was the widow's lantern in Texas. Elegant, eerie, always lit by gaslight that flickered like ghosts on the wall. The saloon girl who ran it was known only as Mara. She never spoke above a whisper, never let a man touch her, and yet every outlaw within 100 miles seemed to fall in love with her. It ended when 2 rival gangs arrived on the same night, both swearing she'd promised herself to them. They faced off across the room, fingers twitching at their holsters, and Mara, she just watched. What happened next is still argued about in ghost stories. Some say Mara stood on the piano and screamed. Others say she kissed the nearest man, then walked into the street and disappeared. What's certain is this: 15 men died that night. The saloon doors were blasted clean off their hinges, and when the sun rose, the widow's lantern stood empty, every mirror shattered and every light still burning. These final nights weren't just accidents. They were endings written into the bones of the buildings, because nothing in the West lasted forever. A man could build a saloon with brick and steel, but sooner or later, a gun, a grudge, or a woman would bring it down. And that's what made them legendary. Not how long they stood, but how fiercely they fell. Some say these places still exist, that if you ride far enough into the desert, past where maps give up, you'll find them. Ruins still glowing from the inside. Bars still stocked with untouched bottles. Piano keys waiting to be played. That's the thing about the West. It doesn't forget. It buries what it needs to, and lets the rest haunt the wind. But if those walls could talk, what would they say? Would they speak of gunfights and glory, or whisper the quieter truths about loneliness, lost dreams, and the endless hunger behind every hard smile? Because in our next series, we'll look not at the outlaws, but at the forgotten souls who cleaned the blood, poured the drinks, and vanished without a name. The silent ones who made the saloon live, and then disappeared like smoke. The silent ones who made the saloons live, and then disappeared like smoke. You know the outlaws. You've heard the names of the killers, the gamblers, the gunmen who turned saloons into shooting galleries. But they weren't the ones who kept the doors open. The truth is, every saloon in the Wild West stood because of invisible hands. Silent figures who worked in the shadows, never asked questions, and almost never got remembered. No songs were written about them, no legends passed down, but without them, there'd have been no whiskey, no cards, no story. Start with the boy who swept the floor. Just a kid, maybe 9 or 10, with dust in his lungs and scars on his knuckles. He'd come in before dawn, barefoot, carrying a mop that was mostly thread. His job? Clean the blood before the day's drinking started. No one asked his name. No one paid him in cash. They gave him scraps, leftover soup, and sometimes a warm corner to sleep in if the rats weren't already there. He saw more death than any sheriff, but he kept quiet, because the moment he spoke out of turn, he was gone. Then there was the cook, if you could call her that. A woman who'd once run from something bad, with a face like stone and a voice like gravel. She worked in the back, where the stove smoked and the meat sizzled, if there was meat. More often, it was whatever she could chop into stew. Raccoon, dog. Occasionally, something she refused to name. Her job wasn't to make it taste good. Her job was to make it hot and fast, to keep the customers full enough not to riot. She heard everything, through thin walls, through the trapdoors that led to secret meetings below. She heard men beg for mercy, heard plans whispered in code, heard the last words of drifters who didn't realize they were marked. And she told no one, not because she didn't care, but because caring got you killed. She had one rule: feed the living, ignore the dying. Then there were the bottle boys, teenagers with chipped teeth and dead eyes who ran whiskey to the tables, replaced empty bottles and dodged flying fists when the fights broke out. Some of them were orphans. Others were sons of prostitutes or prisoners. Most were just desperate. They were fast, quiet, and invisible. And they knew how to disappear when things got hot. One story tells of a bottle boy in Laredo who memorized every face that passed through the saloon. When a sheriff was gunned down and no one claimed to see it, the boy described the killer in perfect detail to a bounty hunter, but only after he was promised a new pair of boots. That killer never made it out of town. The boy, he vanished 2 days later, boots still on. And the piano tuner, the man no one noticed until the music went sour. He'd show up in the middle of the afternoon when the saloon was empty and the dust floated lazy in the air. A quiet man with ink on his fingers and a strange limp, he didn't talk much. Just ran his hands along the keys like he was listening for ghosts. Some said he could hear what the piano had seen, that every note told a story. He'd nod, tighten a string, tap a key, and slip back out into the wind. A ghost in his own right. But perhaps the most forgotten of all were the women who cleaned the rooms upstairs. Not the saloon girls who danced and smiled, but the maids. The ones who scrubbed vomit from floors, who burned bloodied sheets out behind the stables, who found things left behind that no one ever claimed. Letters, locks of hair, fingers. They saw everything, and were expected to pretend they saw nothing. Many of them didn't speak English. Some didn't speak at all. But they worked like machines, breathing through handkerchiefs soaked in rose water to drown out the smell of decay. They'd whisper prayers in Spanish, French, or languages the saloon owner couldn't name. Prayers not for salvation, but for forgetfulness. And what about the old man on the porch? The one who never went inside, just whittled wood and spat tobacco into the dust. Most thought he was crazy, but he wasn't. He was once the saloon's first bartender, or maybe its first killer. No one knew for sure, but every time someone crossed a line, every time a man raised his voice or reached for steel, the old man would stop carving, look up, and stare, just stare, like he was counting down. After enough years, people learned, if the old man stood up, someone wouldn't see morning. All these people, these ghosts in human skin, kept the saloon alive. Not the killers, not the showmen, but the silent ones. The ones who didn't want fame, didn't ask for gold, didn't carve their names into the bar. They lived in the shadows, worked until their backs broke, and disappeared when the West changed, or when the walls came down. Some say they haunt the ruins. That if you walk through an old saloon now, long since abandoned, you might still smell tobacco and blood. You might hear a broom sweeping where no hand moves, or a piano key tapping all by itself. And if you listen closely, you might hear them breathing, the invisible ones, still tending to a bar that the world forgot. Because the West didn't just forget their names, It buried them under the legends. And that's how the Wild West really lived. Not through gunfights, but through the quiet endurance of the ones who cleaned up the mess. But what about those who couldn't disappear quietly? The ones whose names became too big, too feared, too hated to fade away. In our next series, we dive into the haunted legacies of the most brutal saloon owners and bartenders of the Wild West, the kings of the bar who ruled with fists, fire, and fear, until someone finally took them down. The brutal bartenders and saloon kings who ruled with fear. They weren't elected. They didn't wear badges. But in saloon towns across the Wild West, certain men held a different kind of power. The kind forged in blood, built with bourbon, and kept in place by pure, unshakable fear. These weren't just bartenders. They were kings, executioners, tyrants in leather aprons who could settle a gunfight with a glance, or start one with a nod. These men didn't own saloons. They ruled them. And sometimes they ruled the whole town. Take Clayton Cleaver Boone of Leadville, Colorado. A former butcher turned barkeep, Boone kept a cleaver behind the bar instead of a shotgun, and he wasn't afraid to use it. They say he once chopped off a man's trigger finger for reaching for a coin he hadn't paid. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just smiled and swung. The man bled on the bar. Boone poured another drink. "Clean cut," he said. "Now he won't gamble what ain't his." Boone had rules, not posted, not spoken. Everyone just knew them. No hats indoors, no spitting unless you were aiming for the brass bucket, and never, under any circumstance, insult the whiskey. One fool from Kansas called it horse piss. Boone handed him a glass of real horse piss the next round. The man drank it, smiling nervously while the room held its breath. Boone let him live, but no one ever complained again. Then there was Father Macklin in El Paso, the Reverend of Rotgut. A former preacher turned saloon lord. He wore a black coat, quoted scripture, and beat men unconscious with a leather-bound Bible. "Vengeance is the Lord's," he'd say, "but I'm the delivery boy." His bar served liquor so strong it came with a warning. "Don't pray after drinking. God won't understand you." Father Macklin kept order with a kind of holy violence. If you sinned in his bar, you were baptized, face first in the horse trough out back. If you refused, he'd baptize you in your own blood. He believed in redemption, yes, but only after punishment. One outlaw tried to rob the till during Sunday service. Macklin crucified him to the piano with iron nails. The keys never played right after that. And yet, the most feared of all might have been a woman, Miss Delia Cross of Nevada. She didn't run the bar, she ran the town. Her saloon, the Painted Skull, was famous for its silence. No yelling, no music, just slow drinks, low voices, and the sound of a wind chime made from bones. Miss Delia never raised her voice. She didn't have to. If you broke her rules, you simply vanished. No one ever saw her kill, but no one ever questioned who was behind the disappearances. One night, a drunk miner slapped a girl. Delia said nothing, just tapped the bar twice. The lights flickered. By morning, the man was gone. His boots were found hanging from the saloon's sign, full of blood, empty of feet. What made these saloon rulers so terrifying wasn't just their brutality, it was their balance. They weren't wild, they weren't chaotic, they were calm, cold, surgical. They understood the cost of power. And they made sure someone else always paid it. And yet they were respected. Feared, yes, but also admired. Because in a land where the law was a rumor and death came cheap, these barkeeps kept something alive. Order. You might get beat. You might get buried. But you knew the rules. Their violence wasn't madness. It was structure. and people clung to that like driftwood in a river of chaos. But power draws challengers. Always. For every saloon king, there came a man who wanted the throne, and the end was never quiet. Boone was shot by a former customer who lost 3 fingers in a card game. Father Macklin disappeared in the desert, his Bible found filled with bullet holes. Miss Delia, no one knows. Her saloon burned down one night without a scream. Just smoke and silence. Some say she's still alive, watching. What's haunting is how quickly the legends fade. The bones get buried, the saloons rot. Tourists come through 100 years later, snapping photos of foundations and rusted nails, never knowing how many lives were shaped, or ended, on those exact planks of wood. But in the stories that survive, these saloon kings live on. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as something deeper. As echoes. As proof that in the wildest parts of the West, it wasn't always the fastest gun that ruled. Sometimes it was the man, or woman, who knew how to pour a drink with one hand and bury a body with the other. But even the fiercest kings had to fear one thing above all, the arrival of the stranger. Because in our next story, we'll meet the drifters who walked into saloons without a past, left behind nothing but wreckage, and disappeared like ghosts. Some were killers. Some were angels, and some were both. The strangers who walked in and changed everything. They came through the swinging doors without a word, covered in dust, eyes unreadable, hands close to their hips. Strangers, the kind of men, and sometimes women, who didn't belong anywhere, but could change everything just by standing still. No one knew where they came from. No one asked. And when they left, something in the town was always broken. A jaw, a heart, or the entire saloon itself. In the Wild West, the arrival of a stranger meant one thing. A story was about to begin. Or end. Sometimes they were killers. One walked into a saloon in Abilene, ordered a glass of milk, not whiskey, then shot a man dead while drinking it. No one knew why. The two had never spoken, no feud, no debt, but the stranger left a coin on the bar, tipped his hat, and rode out into the night. 3 years later, a letter arrived explaining the victim had killed a child in Arizona. No trial, no court, just justice, cold, quiet, and carried in on boots wrapped in dust. Other strangers came not to kill, but to save. One woman arrived in Deadwood wearing a long gray cloak and a preacher's hat. No one took her seriously until she walked up to the drunkest man in the room, slapped him across the face, and poured his whiskey into the fire. She never drew a weapon, but the next day she opened a mission house 2 doors down. Within a month, the saloon's profits dropped in half. Within 6 months, she vanished. The mission burned. The saloon reopened stronger than ever. But no one forgot her. Some said she was an angel, others weren't so sure. But the strangest strangers didn't speak at all. One man in Texas entered a bar at dusk, sat in a shadowed corner, and stayed for 3 days. Didn't order food, didn't drink, just stared. The barkeep said his presence felt like a loaded rifle, not aimed, but ready. When a fight broke out on the 3rd night, the man finally moved. He stepped between 2 armed men, looked at both, and they lowered their weapons. Then he vanished. No one saw him leave. The next day, a poster was nailed to the post office wall. Wanted, dead or alive. The man's face was on it. The reward was higher than the price of the whole town. Every saloon had a story of a stranger who changed the weather in the room, one who silenced laughter just by sitting down, one who walked in and turned enemies into allies, or brothers into corpses. They didn't smile, they didn't bluff, and they always knew exactly where every exit was. They drank slowly, moved softly, and listened like men who'd already heard it all before. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Sometimes the stranger was exactly what the town needed. When corruption ran too deep, when the sheriff was bought, when the bar owner had blood on his apron and the preacher had whiskey on his breath, the stranger brought something nobody else dared to: balance. They came to even the scale, not for justice, not for revenge, but for something in between. The townsfolk never thanked them. They were too afraid, too confused. And by the time they realized what had happened, that someone evil had vanished, or that someone good had been spared, the stranger was already gone. No goodbyes, no footprints, just silence. Some believe these strangers were former lawmen who'd seen too much. Others say they were outlaws trying to earn their way back into heaven, one bullet at a time. A few swear they weren't human at all, that they were ghosts of justice, walking the plains until the world balanced itself out. And the saloons, they were always the stage, the place where the moment happened. The gun didn't always fire. The fight didn't always break out. But the moment always changed something. A reputation, a rule, a life. The stranger would leave, and suddenly people saw the town differently. And maybe that was the point. Not to bring peace, not to start war, just to shift the weight, one heavy footstep at a time. Some bartenders tried to stop them. Some invited them in. Some just nodded and looked away. Because they knew, once a stranger had chosen your saloon, something in your town's story was about to end, or begin, and there was no stopping it. So next time you picture the Wild West, don't think only of shootouts at noon or train robberies in the dark. Think of that one figure, silent, dusty, unreadable, walking into the bar like he's heard this song before, because maybe he has. And maybe it's time someone else learned how it ends. But not every saloon legend started with a stranger. Some started with something far simpler. A drink. A single glass of something dark and dangerous that changed everything. Because in our next series, we go back to the bar, to the mysterious origins of the Wild West's deadliest cocktails, their strange ingredients, and the secrets they carried. Some healed, some killed, some cursed, and every single one has a story. The deadliest cocktails of the Wild West, and the secrets they carried. The bottles behind the bar gleamed like treasure, each one promising a story, a memory, or a mistake. But in the Wild West, a drink wasn't just a drink. It was medicine, it was poison, it was a dare. Sometimes it was a message. One sip, and you knew exactly what you were walking into. And the men who poured those glasses didn't just know their liquor, they knew how to kill with it. The most infamous drink in Deadwood wasn't whiskey. It was a cocktail called lung fire. It was made with rye, crushed red pepper, laudanum, and a splash of turpentine. Yes, turpentine, a cleaning fluid, and it was served only to those who asked for it by name. If you could finish the glass without coughing or vomiting, your next drink was free. If you couldn't, the saloon had a bucket ready. Most didn't make it to the second sip. Some didn't make it home at all. And then there was the widow's kiss, served only at the Lantern House in New Mexico. The drink looked harmless, pale, sweet-smelling, served in a delicate glass rimmed with sugar. But its ingredients were a mystery. Some claimed it contained absinthe, others said crushed nightshade. Whatever was in it, the effect was always the same. Half an hour of euphoria, followed by either sleep, hallucination, or screaming madness. The bartender didn't keep track. That wasn't his job. Certain cocktails were made not to be enjoyed, but to send a message. If a bartender handed you a drink with a dried chili floating on top, it meant you were being watched. If there was salt only on one side of the rim, you were being warned. Leave now, or you won't walk out. And if your glass was slightly chipped, just slightly, it meant you had a target on your back. The bartender didn't pick the glass by accident. He just followed instructions. Some drinks weren't on the menu at all. You had to know the password. At a saloon in Wyoming, if you ordered a Devil's Prayer, the bartender would serve you a glass of clear liquid and slide a folded note underneath. The note might have a name, a time, or location. Sometimes it had just one word: run. What was in the drink? No one ever really said, but the men who drank it rarely returned. Other cocktails were pure performance, made to impress or terrify. One drink called Snakebite Sunrise was mixed with whiskey, fermented honey, gunpowder, and a sliver of rattlesnake rattle. Light it on fire, take the shot while it burned, and pray you didn't ignite your mustache. It was a favorite among outlaws looking to prove something. More than one man set himself on fire trying. The saloon kept a barrel of water near the bar just for that reason. But not all drinks were deadly by accident. Some were made to kill, quietly, elegantly, the way only a bartender could manage. In Cheyenne, a woman once ordered a lover's mercy for her husband. He was cheating. The bartender nodded, mixed the drink, added a few drops of something from a vial, and handed it over. The man died before the sun went down. Heart failure, they said. The bartender was never questioned. The woman tipped him in silver and never came back. And then there were the drinks whispered about. The cursed cocktails. The ones nobody dared order unless they wanted their lives to change forever. One was called the Last Round. It was served only at midnight. The ingredients were a secret, but the ritual was always the same. The bartender asked, "Are you sure?" And if you nodded, he poured it slow. After you drank it, the saloon would go silent for exactly 1 minute. Then something would happen. A woman might appear at the door. A stranger might collapse. A long-lost debt might be collected. The rules were never clear. Only the consequences. Some old bartenders claimed they kept records of who ordered what, not on paper, but in memory. They remembered every cursed drink, every whispered request, every time someone asked for something strong enough to forget, and they knew exactly how many times those drinks had worked, or failed. But perhaps the strangest thing of all was this. Some of the deadliest cocktails were meant to heal. Tinctures of cactus juice and mezcal used to numb pain. Teas made of herbs and bourbon used to treat snakebite or heartbreak. There was a blurry line between the cure and the curse, and most bartenders walked it with a steady hand and a hollow heart. Because at the end of the day, the saloon was more than a place to get drunk. It was a confessional, a crossroads, a place where you ordered your fate, one glass at a time. So the next time you picture a cowboy slamming back a shot at the bar, ask yourself, what was really in that glass? A thrill, a poison, a promise, or a goodbye? But if the drinks could talk, they'd whisper more than recipes. They'd whisper names. Because behind every cocktail was a man, a woman, a reason, and sometimes a secret meant to stay buried. In our next story, we peel back the final layer, the hidden tunnels, trapdoors, and secret backrooms that turned saloons into fortresses of vice. Gambling, blackmail, smuggling, and disappearances, all hidden in plain sight, right beneath the boots of men who thought they were just there for a drink. Because some saloons weren't bars at all. They were traps, and not everyone who entered made it out the front door. The secret backrooms and trapdoors beneath the bar. At first glance, a saloon was just 4 walls, swinging doors, and the sharp scent of whiskey hanging in the air. But for those who knew better, the real saloon began where the floor creaked and the shadows thickened, in the places behind curtains, below trapdoors, and through doors that didn't open unless you knew how to knock. Because in the Wild West, not every saloon was what it claimed to be. Some were theaters of illusion. Others were carefully constructed traps. You see, behind every loud game of cards or drunken laugh, something quieter was always happening. Something colder. While the front rooms served whiskey and distraction, the back rooms served up deals, betrayal, and blackmail sealed with blood. And if the drinks were the bait, the walls themselves were the net. Let's start with the trapdoors. Almost every major saloon had at least one, usually behind the bar, hidden beneath a worn rug or a stack of crates. At a glance, it looked like part of the floor, but to those who worked there, it was a lifeline. If a raid came, or a brawl got too wild, the owner could vanish in seconds. One twist of a boot heel, one push of a broom handle, and the floor would open like a mouth. What was beneath? That depended. In some cases, it was a tunnel that led to the stables or even across town. In others, it dropped straight into a locked pit, a dirt-walled room used to hide money, weapons, or bodies. More than one lawman fell through a trapdoor while investigating a saloon and was never seen again. The official story? He skipped town. The truth? Buried beneath the floorboards with the others. Then there were the back rooms. Velvet draped, candlelit, always guarded by someone with no sense of humor. These rooms weren't for drinking. They were for deals. Land swindles, bribery, organized theft, murders contracted with a handshake. You couldn't just walk into these rooms. You had to be summoned. And if you left changed, richer, colder, or marked for death. In San Antonio, there was a saloon called the Gilded Knuckle. It had a room upstairs with red wallpaper and no windows. Only 6 chairs. No one ever saw more than 6 men go in, but deals were made that affected the entire county. Ranchers were ruined. Towns were bought. Deputies were replaced. And all of it happened over glasses of silence. Some saloons were used for smuggling. Behind a wall of whiskey barrels, there might be a false back leading to a tunnel, wide enough to drag a coffin through, and often used to do just that. Coffins full of silver, guns, moonshine, or something worse. In one border town, a saloon was built directly over a secret tunnel to Mexico. The bartender poured tequila with one hand and trafficked human cargo with the other. And don't forget the secret staircases. Thin, crooked, often behind shelves or built into closets. They led up to attic rooms, gambling dens where fortunes changed hands in whispers, or down to basements where someone might be questioned until they talked, or stopped talking entirely. If the bartender told you the second floor was closed, it wasn't because of repairs. It was because someone was up there who didn't want to be seen. But maybe the darkest secret of all was this. Sometimes the saloon itself was the bait. It was never meant to be just a place for drinks. It was a hunting ground, designed to lure in men with too much gold, too many secrets, or too big a mouth. The girls were watchers. The piano man was the signal, and the bartender was the spider in the center of the web. Once you were in the web, the only way out was through a deal, a debt, or a shallow grave. And the locals knew. Oh, they knew. They avoided certain tables, refused to sit near certain doors, knew never to ask what happened to the man who was drinking there last night, because the code of the saloon didn't stop at etiquette. It extended into fear. You didn't talk about the back rooms, you didn't touch the trapdoor, and you sure as hell didn't try to open a locked door without permission. But every so often, someone tried. A curious traveler, a drunk with too many questions, a new deputy who didn't understand what he was walking into. They'd slip through a door, or lean on the wrong shelf, or noticed the floor wasn't quite level. And then, nothing. Gone. The only trace left behind? A drink, still half full, collecting flies on the bar. And here's the haunting part. Some of those trapdoors are still there. If you ever visit an old western town, one that's mostly dust and broken windows, peek behind the bars. Tap the floor. Look for uneven boards or nails that don't quite match. You might find a handle, or a hinge, or nothing at all. Just silence, deep and thick. The kind that used to swallow men whole. Because the Wild West wasn't just wild. It was calculated. And the saloon, it was the stage, the snare, and the final curtain all rolled into one. But even in the deepest parts of those rooms, in the lowest basements and the darkest tunnels, something stranger lingered. Belief, superstition, ghosts, whispers. Because in our next chapter, we'll explore the haunted corners of the saloon, the mirrors that cracked on their own, the pianos that played at night, and the lingering presence of those who never left. Some saloons died, but some refused to stay dead. The saloons that refused to die. Ghosts, whispers, and haunted walls. Long after the last drink was poured, after the floors collapsed and the roofs caved in, some saloons still weren't quiet. People claimed to hear footsteps on boards that no longer existed. Laughter drifting on the wind where only ruins remained. Because not every soul that passed through a saloon left it. Some stayed, some refused to leave, and some were never human to begin with. The Wild West believed in ghosts, and nowhere were they stronger than in the places soaked with violence, regret, and unfinished stories. Saloons were magnets for the restless. They drew people in life and held them in death. Start with the mirrors. Nearly every saloon had one behind the bar. Not just for vanity, but so the bartender could see what was coming, a trick of survival. But those mirrors, they kept things. They remembered. In one Nevada saloon, the mirror allegedly showed reflections of people no longer living, men with hats out of style, faces pale and blank, staring back at whoever dared to look. Some bartenders covered them after dark. Others cracked them on purpose, just to stop the whispers. And the pianos. They didn't always stop playing. Even in abandoned buildings, passers-by swore they heard music. Broken, out-of-tune notes plinking from nowhere, floating through boarded windows. One saloon in Montana had its piano removed after the bartender was found dead, slumped across the keys. 2 weeks later, townsfolk claimed to hear it playing at midnight. Same song, same tempo, every night. The piano had been burned, but the music stayed. Some ghosts were harmless, echoes, watchers. Others were not. In Kansas, a saloon called the Clover Bell had a table no one sat at. Just one seat. Always empty. If someone sat there, they said something bad would happen. One man laughed, sat down, and dared the curse to try him. Within a week, his ranch caught fire, his horse broke its leg, and his wife disappeared. He came back to the saloon and shot himself in the chair. No one sat there again. But not all hauntings were stories. Some were warnings. In El Paso, a bartender claimed that whenever someone with murder in their heart entered the saloon, a cold wind would pass through the room, even in summer. If the wind blew twice, he'd close early. The legend spread. One night, the wind blew 3 times. The bartender locked the doors. A stranger pounded on the outside, demanding to be let in. The next morning, the sheriff found 3 bodies down the street. The bartender never opened again. Some ghosts were seen more than once. A woman in white, wandering upstairs rooms where no stairs remained. A man with a black hat, always seated at the corner of the bar, never drinking, never speaking. In Arizona, the spirit of a former saloon girl, known only as Clara, was said to appear in the mirror beside the register. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Bartenders learned to stop glancing at the mirror. Some said her eyes followed you. Others said she was waiting for revenge. And here's the unsettling truth. The buildings didn't have to stand for the hauntings to remain. Whole towns were razed. But the ground remembered. Travelers on horseback told of sudden drops in temperature when passing over old saloon foundations. Horses shied away. Dogs growled at empty lots. Some claimed to hear phantom gunshots. Others crying. Why do the saloons remain haunted, even as the West forgets them? Maybe it's the blood, the betrayals, the desperation packed into the walls like smoke. Or maybe it's because a saloon was never just a building. It was a magnet for the broken, the lost, the dangerous. And when so many unfinished stories gather in one place, the air gets heavy. The past starts to cling. Modern ghost hunters have explored what's left: ruins, cellars, cracked floorboards, with equipment buzzing, cameras blinking, hands trembling. They don't always find answers, but they never walk away untouched. One team investigating the ruins of a Wyoming saloon picked up whispers on their audio recorder. A voice repeating, "It's not over. It's not over." They never returned, and yet there's beauty in it, too. In these echoes, these reminders that something mattered here, that someone once fought, drank, laughed, or wept, hard enough to leave an impression on the world, not in a journal, not in stone, but in the dust and wood and air. Because ghosts don't always haunt out of anger. Some just don't want to be forgotten. So the next time you pass through an old western town and you feel that chill or hear a faint song with no source, pause. Look around. You might be standing on sacred ground, the kind not marked with signs or fences, but with memory. And what about the stories that were never told at all? The secrets buried so deep even the ghosts won't speak them. In our next chapter, we uncover the lost journals, blood-stained ledgers, and cryptic carvings left behind by those who saw too much. Because some saloon secrets were never meant to be heard. Until now, the journals, ledgers, and carvings that shouldn't exist. The walls may have crumbled, the doors long gone, but some saloon secrets didn't vanish. They were written down, hidden, etched into surfaces no one was supposed to read. In corners of attics, buried beneath broken floorboards, and tucked into false drawers behind old bars, strange records have surfaced over the years, scribbled in shaky hands, signed without names, soaked in whiskey, and sometimes blood. These weren't diaries. They were confessions. Ledgers of vice. Last testaments of people who knew the saloon wasn't just a place to drink. It was a stage for damnation. Start with the ledgers. On the surface, they were innocent. Just books for accounting. Lists of bottles sold, meals served, debts owed. But in the back pages, always the back, things got darker. Names appeared next to strange symbols. X's beside certain entries, black dots next to others, and in the margins, numbers that didn't add up. One ledger found in an old Missouri saloon had an entire column labeled "Settled Below." No one knew what that meant. Not until a crawl space beneath the building was found, filled with bones. Then there were the carvings. Every saloon had them. Names scratched into bar tops, initials burned into beams, odd symbols etched into tables. Most were dismissed as idle graffiti, but some had patterns. One particular mark, a three-pronged fork inside a circle, has been found in over a dozen different saloons across the West. Always hidden, always near the floor. No one knows what it means. Historians say it might have been a sign of a secret society. Locals say it meant death. In Colorado, an old bar counter was pulled from a burned-out saloon. On the underside, someone had carved this phrase, "She watches from the glass." No one understood it until they examined the bar's mirror, cracked but intact. When polished, faint smudges appeared in the shape of handprints from the inside. But the most haunting artifacts were the journals, written in pencil, charcoal, sometimes in dried ink that looked too much like blood. They weren't written by famous outlaws or legendary bartenders. They were written by the forgotten, a bottle boy in Dodge City, a saloon girl in Tucson, a bartender's assistant in Nevada. People no one ever remembered, but who saw everything. One journal, now locked away in a private collection, tells of a saloon that changed its floor plan every night. Rooms rearranged, doors opened where none had been before. The writer began drawing maps each day, and none matched. On the final page, he wrote, "Tonight, the back door opened into the desert. I heard someone whisper my name from inside the piano. I won't go in again." Another journal, found beneath a collapsed staircase in Texas, is only 4 pages long. It simply lists names. Next to each, a number, a drink, and the word ode. The final name on the list was the writer's own. Next to it, nothing left to pay with. Still, they drink me dry. Some entries were clearly written during breakdowns, or something worse. "The walls keep breathing," wrote one. "I serve the same man every night. He doesn't age. He tips in gold. His eyes are wrong." Another read, "She came from the mirror again. I locked the bar, burned the stools, but she's in the glass. She wants me to pour." Even stranger were the pages found hidden behind walls, notes slipped between boards like messages in a bottle. They weren't addressed to anyone. They weren't dated, just phrases, looping and frantic. "He knows I saw him bury it. Don't open the 4th bottle. Not a man, not anymore. It's not whiskey, it's her. What are we to make of these?" Maybe they were just hallucinations, the ravings of people pushed too far by alcohol, fear, and isolation. But some researchers say the handwriting often matched across different towns, different years, as if the same person, or something pretending to be one, kept returning to different saloons, leaving breadcrumbs and ink. And then there's the whiskey-stained book locked in the vaults of a Western museum, never displayed. Its pages are brittle, its words half erased, but one line remains clear. "They built this saloon on her grave." No one knows who her was, but the town it came from no longer exists. Wiped from maps. Locals say it burned. The records say it never was. What's most chilling isn't that these journals exist, it's that they were hidden, deliberately, carefully. People didn't want them read, didn't want the truth to survive, and yet it did, in ash, in scribbles, in forgotten drawers beneath bars that still creak when no one's near. Because the Wild West didn't just bury its dead, it buried its truths, and sometimes the wood still whispers. But what if these secrets weren't just stories? What if they were rituals, warnings, traces of something deeper that moved from town to town, using the saloon as a gate? In the next chapter, we go one step further, into the legends of the cursed saloons, the ones that vanished overnight, and the theory that they weren't just buildings, but doors to something else entirely. And once opened, they never truly closed. The cursed saloons that vanished, and the doors that never closed. They were built like any other. 4 walls, swinging doors, barrels of whiskey stacked behind the bar. Laughter, music, smoke in the air. But some saloons didn't just close down, they disappeared, gone without fire, without flood, without warning. And what was left behind wasn't silence. It was a gap, an empty place in the land, a wound. Because some saloons were never just saloons, they were thresholds, gates, doors pretending to be buildings. And when those doors opened, something came through. The legend begins with the Hollow Fern, a saloon said to have existed in the hills outside Yuma. No map marked it, no town claimed it, but cowboys spoke of it in hushed tones. They said it only appeared in moonlight, that the doors were always open, that you could ride for hours through dry, empty land, then turn a corner and there it was, lit up like Sunday night, music already playing. But once you stepped inside, you weren't in Arizona anymore. No one who entered ever remembered the same details. One man swore the barkeep had no eyes. Another described a floor that rippled like water. Someone else said he ordered a drink and saw every mistake he'd ever made, floating in the glass. Most walked out hours later, pale, confused, changed. A few never came out at all. And then one day, it was gone. Completely. Riders who'd visited it before returned to find an empty clearing. No sign of boards, no ash. Just a spot where the wind blew colder and the birds never landed. It wasn't the only one. There was the Black Lantern in northern Wyoming, a saloon that hosted no music, no women, no laughter. Just men sitting in silence, drinking in perfect rhythm, never speaking. Witnesses said the light inside wasn't fire or gas. It was dim and green, like swamp glow. One man tried to take a photograph. The glass plate shattered. The saloon vanished the next week. His camera melted in its case. In Utah, an entire town vanished after building a saloon atop an old native burial site. The structure itself was built in a single night. No plans, no known workers. Just appeared. Within days, the town's animals fled. Crops failed. People began sleepwalking, drawing strange symbols on the walls in charcoal. A priest tried to burn it. The fire died. A marshal tried to close it. He was found nailed to the door. Then came the wind, hot, screeching, unnatural. By morning, nothing remained. Theories spread like dry brush fire. Some said the saloons were cursed, that certain land remembered blood and built traps to catch more. Others believed these places were feeding grounds, that something old and hungry built the bars, poured the drinks and waited. Not for customers, for offerings. And still some insist it's just folklore, that no building can vanish, that people disappear, yes, but not whole saloons. But then, what of the roads that lead nowhere? The towns with missing numbers? One map from 1883 lists a saloon called the Endless Cup in Nevada. By 1890, the town was gone. And yet, the name still shows up in dream journals, in scrawled graffiti near train stations, and even in the burned margin of a church ledger in New Mexico. People have tried to find them. Modern explorers, ghost hunters, skeptics. They follow the stories, the half-maps, the whispers from old men in care homes who still mutter, "Don't drink there, don't look in the mirror." And some of these seekers return, but never the same. One came back speaking only Spanish. He'd never spoken a word before. Another burned all his clothes in a churchyard and wouldn't explain why. A third carved the words, "It's not a building," into a whiskey barrel and vanished the next day. Because maybe that's the truth. Maybe these cursed saloons weren't buildings at all. Maybe they were ideas, constructs formed by belief, grief, and guilt. Maybe they gathered themselves where the land was weakest, or where the stories were strongest, where men had sinned enough to create a space for something else to enter. Some say the saloons are still out there, that they move, shift, hide in plain sight. You walk into a new bar in a ghost town and feel the air thicken. The bartender doesn't blink enough. The drink you order tastes like something you've never had. And yet, remember, the mirror doesn't show your reflection quite right. The music plays a little too slow. You leave. You look back. The bar is gone. One railroad worker in 1911 claimed he saw a saloon appear outside the window of a moving train, just standing in the middle of the plains lit like Christmas. No road, no people, just a building, waiting. He blinked, and it was gone. He refused to ride that route again. Quit the next day, said he had seen the drinking place that drinks back. And if these saloons are doors, the question remains, who built them? Who poured the first cursed drink? Who opens the trap doors now that the bartenders are dust and memory? Maybe it's no one. Maybe it's everyone. Maybe the land remembers. Maybe the story does. Because the Wild West was never about just men and guns. It was about what those men brought with them, their sins, their regrets, their need to forget. And if you build enough of that in one place, something has to answer. We return to the living, to the first saloon keepers, the earliest makeshift bars built from wagons and blankets. Before the buildings, before the legends, before the blood. This is where it all began, in lonely camps, desperate towns, and the first time a man handed another man a drink and said, "Here, forget." Where it all began, the first saloons of the Wild West. Before the chandeliers, before the polished bars and swinging doors, before piano players and poker tables, there was just dust, wind, and thirst. The first saloons weren't buildings at all. They were blankets stretched over wagon wheels, crates nailed together in mining camps, whiskey poured from mason jars under open sky. There was no name carved above the door, because there was no door. Just a man with something to sell, and others with something to forget. The earliest saloons in the American frontier weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival, for keeping the cold out, the sheiks at bay, and the gold miners just drunk enough to go back into the mountains the next day. You didn't ask for what kind of drink it was. You just drank. If it burned, it was real. If it didn't, it was water, and water couldn't kill the pain. The very first saloon recorded west of the Mississippi opened in 1822 in Browns Hole, Wyoming, and it wasn't much more than a tent. The man who ran it, Louis Robidoux, sold raw whiskey from a barrel and made customers bring their own cups. No menu, no music, just booze, bullets, and the occasional fight that spilled out into the sagebrush. That tent served trappers, traders, and men who hadn't heard a woman's voice in 3 years. It also hosted at least 4 killings in its first week. And yet, word spread like wildfire. A place where you could drink, curse, and bleed without judgment. That was worth riding for. Within a few years, more pop-up saloons appeared, some in wagons, others dug halfway into the sides of hills for shelter. They were made of canvas, pine boards, or old army tents, but they served the same purpose: numb the world. These were the birthing grounds of the Western saloon, wild, lawless, half-imagined places where social rules didn't apply and violence wasn't an accident. It was decor. You didn't walk into one expecting to be safe. You walked in knowing full well that you might walk out with a limp, a wife, or a death sentence, depending on the mood of the man next to you. There were no saloon girls in those early days. No barkeeps with waxed mustaches. Just grizzled veterans of the trail, eyes raw from smoke, hands shaking from too many cold nights and not enough food. They didn't flirt. They didn't smile. They just poured, and sometimes passed out halfway through. But from those rough beginnings, something strange started to grow. Men started building walls, a real roof, maybe even a table. They carved names into the wood, not just their own, but the names of those they'd lost. And then came the mirror, not because they needed to see themselves, but because they wanted to feel like something was watching, even if it was just their own face blinking back through the haze. The first bar stools were just crates. The first floors were dirt. The first rules were unwritten, but they were enforced with a stare or the slam of a bottle. These early saloons became the new churches of the frontier, places to confess, places to fight, places to forget. And slowly, a rhythm formed. Men came in after work, left their hats on hooks, sat in the same spot, drank the same drink. Some stayed until the stars blinked out. Others died before they finished their third glass. But always, the saloon remained. No matter the shape, no matter the owner. The saloon stayed, like something older than the land itself, something that wanted to exist, like the dirt kept rebuilding it, even after the walls collapsed. And the first real buildings, they rose like mirages. In Deadwood, Tombstone, Dodge, places where dreams went to starve and gold turned to blood. Men pooled their money, built wooden frames, hired carpenters. Hung signs, the Silver Star, the Lucky Drop, the Gilded Tooth. Some lasted years, others burned in days. But each one took its cue from the first saloons. Those tents, those crates, those outlaw prayers whispered into tin cups beneath a burning sky. Because in the end, every grand saloon, every bar with velvet wallpaper and hand-carved railings was just an echo of that first man, handing over a drink and saying nothing. No comfort, no explanation. Just the quiet mercy of something hot, bitter, and blinding. And that's where it all began. Not with the myths, not with the duels, but with the silence between two men who both knew the West didn't care if they lived or died, and still chose to drink anyway. But if those first saloons were about survival, what happened when money entered the picture? When politics, law, and empire seeped through the cracks of the saloon floorboards? In the next chapter, we follow the transformation, from rough watering hole to the power center of the town. Because, in time, the saloon didn't just serve the people, it ruled them. When the saloon became the throne, power, politics, and the whiskey empire. In the beginning, the saloon was a shack, a shelter from wind and regret. But as the West expanded, the saloon grew teeth. It wasn't just a place to get drunk anymore. It became the place where decisions were made, where deals were struck, where futures were bought with liquor, and bloodlines were ended over cigars. The bar wasn't just a counter, it was a throne, and the man behind it, often more powerful than the mayor, the marshal, or the preacher. Because once money entered the saloon, everything changed. The gold rushes brought it first, then the cattle drives, then the railroads. With every new boomtown came a wave of fortune hunters and scoundrels, and where they went, the saloons followed, quickly, quietly, and with their eyes wide open. These weren't tents and crates anymore. These were buildings made of hardwood and stone. Stained glass windows, oil paintings of half-naked women, pianos brought in by wagon teams, velvet ropes and imported wallpaper, and behind it all, the books. Because by the 1870s, the most successful saloons weren't just bars. They were businesses, ruthless ones. The barkeep knew your name, your habits, your debts. He knew who had land, who had gold, and who had nothing left to lose. He didn't just serve drinks, he served leverage. And if you couldn't pay with coin, he'd find something else to take. Political campaigns were launched from saloon tables. Town councils were bought with a bottle. Marshals were chosen based not on justice, but on who owed the barkeep fewer favors. In some towns, the sheriff's badge hung on a nail behind the bar. And if you asked who really ran things, the answer was clear: the man pouring the drinks. Some saloons printed their own scrip, tokens that could be used only in their bar or casino. Others ran their own banks in the back room, offering loans with interest rates sharp enough to bleed. Couldn't pay? Your ranch was now part of the saloon's holdings. Your horse, now part of the delivery service. Your daughter, suddenly offered a singing job upstairs. And if you resisted, there was always a man in the corner who didn't mind making you disappear. Even the churches knew not to interfere. One preacher in Montana tried to shut down the Glass Widow Saloon. He marched in with a Bible, declared it a house of sin, and poured a bottle out on the floor. The owner, a woman named Sarah Black, smiled, offered him a drink, and then had him found the next morning drunk in the river, wearing someone else's boots. The town called it a baptism. The church doors stayed closed after that. Because the saloon didn't just serve drinks, it served identity. It told you who belonged, who mattered, who could sit where and speak how. If you walked into a bar and the music stopped, you had two choices: apologize or leave before someone stood up. Every table in the saloon had a history. One table was where a judge signed away half the town to the railroad. Another where two miners agreed to share a vein of gold, only for one to be poisoned an hour later. Another table never had chairs. It was for standing deals, the kind that ended in gunfire or lifelong silence. And the bartenders knew it all. They weren't slurring men with the aprons anymore. They were architects of control. They handled money, favors, rumors. If someone wanted land surveyed, a permit granted, a rival intimidated. They didn't go to City Hall. They went to the saloon. One saloon in Kansas, the Duke's Canteen, was said to have 3 guest ledgers. One for drinks, one for debts, and one for secrets. The secrets ledger was kept in a locked iron case under the floor. Rumor was it held letters, confessions, names of men who had betrayed wives, business partners, or laws. The bartender didn't charge for it. He just held it until he needed something from you. And when a saloon grew too powerful, what happened? Towns burned, literally. Competing bars were torched in the night. Mayors were shot during poker games. One ambitious governor tried to pass a temperance law and was found with his tongue cut out, the word dry carved into his chest. The bill didn't pass. Even lawmen became lapdogs. A sheriff in Arizona admitted on his deathbed that he had taken orders from the owner of the Brimstone Bar for 14 years, enforcing laws only when they didn't interfere with whiskey profits. "I kept the peace," he wrote, "but I didn't own it." Because the saloon became the heart of power. The bank, the courthouse, the confession booth, all lit by oil lamps and masked by laughter. And the most powerful men in town weren't the ones with badges. They were the ones who decided who drank and who didn't. But eventually cracks formed. The empire couldn't last. Money changed everything, but it also attracted enemies: prohibitionists, reformers, and worse, the rising temperance movement. In the next chapter, we watch the war begin, a battle between saloon culture and the wave of puritanical fire that tried to shut it all down. Because for every man pouring a drink, someone was coming to smash the bottle.